Welcome to the Gerbil Experiments with Megan Stevens of eatbeautiful.net. Hi there, I'm Megan Stevens with eatbeautiful.net. Today we're going to address the topic of vitamin A and the scientists who did the studies with humans and why they believed so strongly that vitamin A was an essential nutrient. So I've talked about this in the past and why it's important that we explore why this isn't true. So today we're going to look at those studies, and I think you'll see even history proves that vitamin A is very much not an essential nutrient. So I also just want to apologize for taking so long to come out with this third video. My mom actually passed away, and as a result I got sick and I was in bed for a couple of months, so it just took me a long time to recover. So I'm super happy to be back and excited to be doing this series. So let's jump right in and start looking at the studies. For decades, authorities have told us that vitamin A is a life-saving nutrient and that without it, children in the developing world go blind, succumb to measles, and die in preventable numbers. This belief has driven one of the largest and most expensive global health programs in history, delivering billions of doses annually to over 100 countries targeted by the World Health Organization. It has put men like Alfred Sommer, one of the men I want to talk to you about today, on stages accepting awards and given pharmaceutical and supplement industries a mandate that spans generations. But if the science behind it is all wrong, and if the conclusions they drew were premature, the experiments were flawed, then the very thing we've been told prevents blindness is actually causing it. So that's what we're going to discuss and establish. Let's start with the studies that built the framework, because we can't dismantle the argument without understanding what it says. So why do so many scientists say that vitamin A is a vitamin that is essential for wellness? The foundational premise comes from a 1968 review by Scrimshaw and colleagues, which concluded that vitamin A deficiency showed what they call synergism with almost every known infectious disease. In other words, they argued that being low in vitamin A made you more vulnerable to virtually everything. Sommer claimed that even mild vitamin A deficiency impeded a child's ability to fight off disease. His findings were dramatic, and his confidence was absolute. And on the strength of his work, the global health establishment began constructing a program with staggering reach. The studies that followed claimed to confirm his conclusions. Trials conducted across Southeast Asia, Indonesia, India, Nepal, and Sub-Saharan Africa reported reductions of 75% or more in rates of childhood xerophthalmia, which is the eye condition associated with vitamin A deficiency. And studies from Gambia reported that vitamin A supplementation reduced death rates from measles by 50%. These were the numbers, understandably, that changed policy and provided the moral justification for delivering billions of doses to the world's poorest children, and for what Sommer himself described as controlling the food systems of impoverished nations to fortify them with vitamin A. Sommer's wording is disturbing, and here is where the story itself also starts to unravel. Alfred Sommer has been celebrated as a hero of global public health, but a careful reading of the evidence, including his own published works, tells a really different story. So now I'm going to go to Grant Generous, who many of you have heard about. He wrote the now becoming famous ebooks about why vitamin A is a toxin, and I'm going to delve into one of his books, Poisoning for Profits, which documents something remarkable. Sommer and Keith P. West's 1996 book titled Vitamin A Deficiency, Health, Survival, and Vision contains data that directly contradicts its own conclusions. Their own records show that a significant proportion of children with clinical xerophthalmia had serum vitamin A levels above the threshold considered deficient, while many children without any symptoms fell below it. Sommer's own text also notes that xerophthalmia is rare in children under 2 years of age, and that newborns appear almost entirely protected from it. His explanation? Inherited maternal immunity. But there is a simpler, more troubling explanation. The symptoms appear after vitamin A intervention begins. And then there is perhaps the most condemning admission in the literature. Sommer and West's own book acknowledges that infants aged 1 to 3 months who were given 100,000 IU doses of vitamin A may have suffered increased mortality. not just side effects, increased death rates. The excess deaths were concentrated among the best nourished children. Their response to this finding was to call it statistically insignificant and to say it specifically awaits biological explanation. They kept the program running. Genera offers the biological explanation they claimed to lack. Well-nourished children already have full liver stores of vitamin A. A massive additional dose becomes acutely toxic. The babies weren't being saved, they were being poisoned, and the children who died were supposedly the healthiest ones, but the ones with actually no room left in their bodies to absorb more. You might know that pregnant women, we're advised to stay away from vitamin A during pregnancy, and yet they're giving it to newborn 1-month-old children, so of course it's going to be toxic. After 50 years of global supplementation programs, the WHO still estimates that 190 million children under 5 are affected by vitamin A deficiency. 50 years, over 100 countries, billions of doses, and the problem by their own numbers has not yet been solved. Any honest reading of that outcome should have triggered a fundamental reassessment decades ago. We have shocking death rates. We have no progress in the health epidemic. Instead, the answer has always been supplement more. To understand why Sommer and the researchers before him went so badly wrong, we need to go back further to the earliest experiments that supposedly established vitamin A as an essential nutrient in the first place. Those experiments were flawed at the foundation, and I've talked about them before. The diets used in early animal studies weren't truly vitamin A free. They contained substantial amounts of the compound, often hidden in ingredients like lard, which contained retinoic acid, a more toxic form of vitamin A, and also casein, which acts as a key carrier for vitamin A, making it more toxic. When animals became sick on these diets and then recovered when researchers substituted butter, the researchers credited vitamin A supplementation as the cure. But Genera argues they had it backwards. The animals recovered not because they received a missing nutrient, but because they had removed the more toxic lard from their diet. I want to point out that even if the animals were missing a nutrient, it's not good science to say it was vitamin A because researchers hadn't isolated it. Butter has protective compounds like vitamin K, butyrate, and conjugated linoleic acid that could have benefited the rats. A 1960 Harvard study attempted to resolve this question by supplementing the supposedly deficient diet with retinoic acid directly, and the animals still developed xerophthalmia. They still died. This should have ended the claim that retinoic acid or vitamin A was the beneficial factor, but it didn't. So let's talk briefly about retinoic acid. What we know about retinoic acid now makes its toxicity in the earlier studies even harder to ignore. Retinoic acid, also sold under the brand name Accutane, is documented to cause xerophthalmia, night blindness, meibomian gland atrophy, and photophobia in humans. Those are the exact same symptoms wrongly attributed to vitamin A deficiency. Genera's conclusion is direct. Vitamin A deficiency and vitamin A toxicity produce identical symptoms because they're the same condition. The earlier researchers weren't studying a deficiency, they were observing a poisoning. And they built an entire century of nutritional science on top of that misreading. If vitamin A deficiency causes blindness and death, then the historical and real-world record should confirm it, but it doesn't. The evidence that follows in this next part of the video is really easy to understand and irrefutable. It's one of my favorite pieces of information on this topic. The case of World War II prisoner of war camps is perhaps the most decisive, real-world test of the deficiency model that exists. Prisoners in Japanese camps during World War II survived for 3 or more years on approximately 1 cup of rice per day, which has essentially 0 vitamin A, under conditions of extreme starvation, brutal labor, infection, and prolonged sun exposure. Upon liberation, Western physicians examined them and noted that their eyes were in exceptional condition. No lesions, no xerophthalmia, no blindness. The vitamin A deficiency model predicts that these men should have been nearly universally blind, but they weren't. And the same was observed in survivors of German prisoner of war camps. And there's more. The summer seasonality of xerophthalmia adds another layer of contradiction. The disease peaks in summer months, precisely when vitamin A from fruits, vegetables, and dairy is at its highest. A genuine deficiency disease would peak in winter when those food sources are scarce. The summer pattern also suggests something else, that sunlight is activating vitamin A as a toxin in the tissues of people who are already accumulating it, so they get worse or develop symptoms during these months. And fourthly, I love this argument, North Americans consume vitamin A at levels perhaps 100 to even 1,000 times higher than historical human diets. Deficiency should be essentially impossible, yet nearly half of all Americans regularly experience the symptoms doctors associate with vitamin A deficiency, specifically dry eye symptoms, the defining symptom of xerophthalmia. The same disease has simply been renamed. In Southeast Asia, it's called a deficiency. In a North American optometrist's office, it's dry eye disease. The diagnostic category changes based on geography and convenience, not biology. And meibomian gland dysfunction, another classic symptom of supposed vitamin A deficiency, gets its own separate clinical name to avoid the inconvenient connection. Okay, finally, we're going to talk about rhodopsin. And the scientific establishment kind of clings to this argument when they are trying to establish that vitamin A is a necessary nutrient. The retina contains a light-sensitive pigment called rhodopsin, made up of a protein bound to retinol, which is a derivative of vitamin A. When light strikes the rod cells, it triggers a chemical reaction that sends a signal to the brain, and the retinol is consumed in that reaction. So vitamin A, by their understanding, must be continually supplied, and therefore it's essential to sight. So in Grant's book, or Genero's book, he doesn't dispute that retinol is present in rhodopsin. What he disputes is whether the model holds up to basic scrutiny. We have to consider the volume of visual information the human eye processes every second. If each signal required a chemical reaction consuming vitamin A, those reactions would generate an incredible amount of heat and actually destroy the eye. Researchers have documented the byproducts of those reactions as carcinogens. And by any reasonable calculation, a person would need to consume a lethal daily dose of vitamin A to sustain vision through this mechanism. So their whole understanding of how vision works and how vitamin A is required isn't correct. Let's also consider the empirical record. If vitamin A were continuously consumed by vision, then deprivation should produce progressive measurable deterioration and eventually blindness. But no one has ever observed that in prolonged starvation. Observers do not see it in the POW camps, and researchers did not find it in the long-term studies that the deficiency model relies on. And then physiologically, and perhaps most telling, the worst damage from supposed vitamin A deficiency actually occurs not in the retina, where rhodopsin lives, but in the lens and in the cornea, and then also in the surrounding tissues. So these structures actually contain no vitamin A. They have no connection to the rhodopsin cycle. A deficiency of something that is not present in a tissue can't really logically cause a disease in that tissue. And yet that is exactly what the deficiency model requires us to believe. And then I just want to add that there's a much better explanation. Protein deficiency is more credible as far as a reason for many of the vision problems attributed to vitamin A. Protein provides the amino acids necessary for repairing and regenerating the cornea, the retina, and the lens. Protein deficiency is directly linked to cataracts, which occur through protein oxidation and the aggregation in the lens. It is linked to age-related macular degeneration. And then the populations we are supplementing with vitamin A are actually malnourished populations. They're the ones that are protein and zinc deficient. They're the ones that need protein, so it makes sense that they would have symptoms that reflect that. And yet somehow scientists are trying to give them a compound instead of, if they're going to give them anything, giving them a meal. Colorful produce is a modern luxury and it's a fad right now, but it is not a necessity. What we really need is protein, fiber, and clean water. I would also like to talk about the ethics of what's being done. There is a scientific argument to be made here, and I've made it, but there's also a moral argument, and it needs to be spoken about. Countries like India have resisted what critics there call the magic capsule. While the Indian government officially cooperates with organizations like UNICEF and the WHO, there's deep-seated distrust among Indian public health experts and parts of the government regarding the necessity and safety of mass distribution campaigns. Indian pediatricians and nutritionists have strongly criticized UNICEF and other international agencies, accusing them of commercial exploitation of malnutrition and needlessly pushing universal supplementation. Prominent Indian experts have argued that the data simply doesn't support the massive reduction in child mortality that Western agencies frequently cite, and that vitamin A deficiency has declined enough in India to make universal dosing unnecessary, especially weighed against risks like bulging fontanelles in young children. Things actually came to a head with the Assam incident, which happened in 2001 and 2. Following a UNICEF-backed statewide campaign in November of 2001, either somewhere between 14 and 23 children died and thousands became ill, triggering a massive backlash. The Assam Human Rights Commission partially blamed the deaths on high doses administered of vitamin A. Since then, India hasn't abandoned the program entirely, but it has moved to restrict the universal nature of the campaigns, shifting toward more targeted approaches in high-risk areas and dietary approaches. The health ministry has maintained that existing data was never robust enough to justify universal supplementation in the first place. While India formally cooperates with UN agency, it largely views these vitamin A campaigns as Western-driven initiatives. The response of the WHO and UNICEF has not been to listen or to question their assumptions or to take seriously the possibility that their science might be wrong. The response has been to fortify foods, so to add vitamin A to the food supply without people's knowledge or consent so that populations who have rejected the supplement receive it anyway. When scientists, however well-intentioned, decide that a population is too uneducated to understand what is good for them and proceed to alter their food supply, they have crossed a line that cannot be justified by their credentials. History is full of examples of exactly this kind of certainty that turned out to be catastrophic, and the people who paid the price were always the ones with the least power to refuse. If the science were sound, transparency would cost nothing. The fact that transparency has been abandoned in favor of fortification should itself be a warning. What these populations need is not a molecule that has been misunderstood for a century. They need protein, they need zinc. As I mentioned, they need clean water and real food. So meat, unfortified grains, fruits, and vegetables grown in healthy soil. These are not exciting conclusions. They don't generate patents or profits or award ceremonies, but they are true. The story of vitamin A supplementation is not a story of science following the evidence. It is a story of researchers reaching a conclusion early, defending it long past the point where the evidence supported it, and imposing it on the world's most vulnerable populations without their consent and without honest reckoning with the data. Alfred Sommer's own published work documents children dying from the doses he championed. His own data shows symptoms appearing in children with normal vitamin A levels. The foundational animal experiments were contaminated with the very toxin they were supposedly studying. And the real-world record from POW camps to population histories spanning thousands of years consistently fails to support the deficiency model. For generations, authorities have told us that vitamin A saves lives. The evidence, read carefully and without a financial or ideological stake in the outcome, suggests it is doing the opposite. And until researchers take that possibility seriously, until they are willing to follow the data rather than defend the program they've started, supplementation will continue, fortification will continue, and harm will continue. So join me in sharing this video. The more we share, the more people know, the more self-reflective we become and less ignorant, the more we can help the people who are being targeted by UNICEF, the World Health Organization, and whatever other people in power have some ulterior motive. Once again, thanks so much for watching my video. Please like and subscribe. Also, if you can comment on the video below, that really helps to generate traffic, which will help exposure for the video and help get this information out there. Thanks so much. I'll see you next time when I will actually talk more about the gerbils, and I've even done some experiments on rats in the last few months, and I will share the findings I have so far next time. Thank you.